Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, and I'm here with my co-host, Alan Reinach, who is president of the Church State Council and also a litigator extraordinaire when it comes to issues of church and state and First Amendment freedoms. And together we are trying to take back religious liberty from the political extremes. Well, today we are talking exactly about that, how to survive in a world of political extremes. So many of us, we are just worn out by the culture wars. We do not want to pick up a newspaper. We do not want to listen to the news. We feel pressured to pick sides. We're not sure what faithful engagement looks like when it comes to politics today. And I'm hoping, Alan, that our guests will have some insights for us. And I'm excited to get started. So why don't you go ahead and introduce him?
We are delighted to welcome to Just Liberty today Justin Giboney, an attorney, political strategist, ordained minister, podcaster, and author in Atlanta, Georgia, co-founder and president of a Christian civic organization called the AND Campaign, and author of his most recent book we're going to talk about today, Don't Let Nobody Turn You Around, How the Black Church's Public Witness Leads Us Out of the Culture War. And I'd like to know, because I'd like to get us out of the culture war. So, Bettina, take us away here.
Well, I think the most obvious question is, what brought you to this topic?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say thank you, Bettina and Alan, for having me on the show. This is a very personal book. So the book, it's historical. There's some social commentary, but there's also some personal history. And so the book starts with my maternal grandmother and her favorite gospel artist, who was Mahalia Jackson, and kind of uses their life as an example of who the civil rights generation was. And so really what I wanted to do is dig into who the civil rights generation really was and how they might respond to the culture war.
How do you see the example of the civil rights leaders shaping your view of culture war today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one thing I think is important about the book is that it's not saying that culture war issues aren't important, right? So definitions of marriage, what our kids are learning in school when it comes to sex education and all that, those are important issues. I'm not asking anybody not to care about those. I think it's how we go about it. And if we look at the civil rights generation, I think they give us a model of how to go about that in a better way, from how they viewed themselves to how they viewed their opposition. And they had very serious opposition. I mean, in many cases, opposition who were willing to take their lives, and they still viewed them very differently than I believe we view our culture war opponents today.
Well, in what way do you see them as an example?
Mm-hmm. So I see them as example, number one, in using a different framework. When I look at the culture war, I see a good versus evil framework. Well, either given side may have issues to say, hey, that side is really wrong on something. So that can be true. But to act as if the other side is purely evil and you're good, as if the other side is irredeemable and whatever you do is somehow justifiable, I think is wrong. Because what it does, number one, is it causes you not to examine yourself. So if you look at Fannie Lou Hamer, people like that, if you look at what they were saying, even if you look at the songs they were singing, there was always a recognition of their potential for wrong and their potential, their sinfulness and their issues too, as they engaged. Like God cleanse us. For instance, before any social action would move forward in the civil rights movement, one of the steps that they would take, in addition to negotiation and all those other things, was self-purification, to make sure that as I engage with someone else, no matter how wrong they are, that I'm actually moving forward with the right spirit and that I'm being redemptive myself. I don't know that we do that type of reflection, because if we assume the other side is always wrong, then we don't really have a whole lot of work to do to get ourselves right. All we have to do is fight them. And I think that we run into a lot of trouble when that's our perspective.
And the flip side of that, I guess, the flip side of that sort of self-awareness is the idea that no one is beyond redemption, right? That the other side is redeemable, and not just cast beyond the pale. So how does that dynamic play into how we approach typical culture war issues?
I think we have to listen a little better. One thing I've noticed is people, even when they're wrong, usually aren't purely malicious. There's some good that they're trying to get at. And I try to articulate what that good is before I really engage in any type of argument. I want to be able to say, this is what this person thinks they're achieving. And I may actually learn something from that. A good historical example, and this is full of historical examples. One example of this is in 1972, the presidential race between, two of the people who ran, I should say, were Shirley Chisholm, who's the first Black woman ever to run for president, but also the Governor Wallace, who was known as arch segregationist and all those things. He ends up getting shot in a assassination attempt. And Shirley Chisholm, being a Christian, takes off of her campaign and goes to visit this man who didn't want her to be able to run for office, didn't want her to vote, probably didn't want her to be very well educated, had no concern for any of those things. But she takes her time to go see him. And she gets there and says, "I'm sorry that this happened to you. This should never have happened to you, regardless of what you were talking about." Then what's amazing to me is she also goes over with him what he gets right. So she says, "You know what? I think you're right about how corporations have too much say, how small people aren't treated well within our country right now. I think those are things that we agree on." To me, that's amazing, because I think once somebody disagrees with us on our issue, so let's say my issue is race, your issue is abortion, we feel like they have nothing to contribute. Not only was she able to withstand his bigotry, but also look beneath that to see what he was saying otherwise that he might actually be right on. That's the kind of interaction that I'm talking about. It's saying someone can be wrong about something major. I still might be able to learn some from them. And in respecting their human dignity, I'm going to hear them out. We're often kind of too hypersensitive to do that. And also, I think we hold people in contempt to where we don't think they have a contribution to make.
It's just a recognition of humanity, right? It's a recognition of shared humanity.
That's right.
Sorry, Alan, go ahead.
Well, it just, listening to you, it's like, well, I want to turn algorithm into a verb. We've been algorithmized, right? We're all so in these information bubbles that we're not engaging with people or ideas that, aren't exactly the same as our own. And I mean, I have tried, because of my work, to find responsible voices, across the spectrum, so I can get some different perspectives, not just those that, mirror my own views. But I don't think that many people are intentionally trying to do that. I think we need to do more of that.
That's right. And as Christians, we need to deliberately make that effort. Just in being like Jesus, if you even look at how he assembles his disciples, it seems to me to be a deliberate effort to bring people who are very different together in a way that we would never imagine. But yet we feel like if somebody offended me, then I don't have to engage them. I think that's wrong.
Well, there's this personal role that we have in guarding against this sort of hyperbole and unforgiving rhetoric, but there's also the public witness of the church. How do you think the Christian church is doing in 2026 in terms of its public witness as a representation of the character of God?
Obviously, we're not a monolith, right? So there are different parts of the church doing better than others. As a whole, much to be desired. I don't think we have the moral clarity that we need, because right now, it seems to me that we're captured by the moment, that whatever issue we're most concerned about, we're so captured in what's going on with that right now and what our opposition is doing, that we're not seeing past this moment to the virtues and principles that we need to be upholding for everybody else. This is another key to what the civil rights generation was able to do. And I talk about this in the book in terms of moral imagination. Moral imagination is the ability to see not just what's happening, not just what's happened in the past or what's likely to happen in the future. It's the ability to see what ought to be. This is what Shirley Chisholm is doing. She's not just looking at what Wallace has said. She's looking at what he could be, not what he has done and the policies that he's promoted, what he could accomplish and the person he could be. We don't do that because we're so caught up in the moment that we don't see beyond this. And so even, when the civil rights, when they're singing songs like Keep Your Eyes on the Prize, this is what they're talking about. Seeing past the moment and being able to be an example because you're not captured by it, because there's something bigger.
Well, it strikes me in terms of the subject of the church's public witness that one of the biggest impediments today is the grasp for power. That one of the critiques, frankly, of the American church is that the church has accepted the temptation, the third temptation of Christ that he rejected, which is, to gain power over the kingdoms of the world, a kind of dominion theology. And I just, I wonder in terms of the politics of the right today and the politics of the civil rights era. How do you see, how do you see them different? Because obviously both communities have certain political agendas, but coming out of very different cultural contexts. But how do you compare the goals and the methods of the civil rights era black church with what we're seeing from the white church today?
Yeah, well, if you look at parts of the white evangelical church today that are engaged in this culture war, that's what the culture war is. It's a grasp for power. It's the desire to control the narrative and the identity of American society. Who are we and what do we value? That's what this battle between conservatives and progressives is about. The difference between what we're seeing now, right? Because let's think about if we're going to be honest, the culture war over the years, one or the other side has gone back and forth. And every time one side gets a little bit of an advantage, what do? They go too far, right? The left gets an advantage. They start putting stuff in schools that people don't want their kids to engage with. Or the right gets a little advantage. They start creating laws that are kind of infringing on people's liberty here and there. It's over and over again, each side showing that they don't really have the sobriety to get power and not go too far with it. So the difference, though, the nature of what the civil rights movement was trying to do was very different, because they didn't even really have the luxury of fighting for that kind of dominating power. They were fighting for rights, right? This is much more similar to the Hebrews coming out of Egypt. With they're fighting for liberation, to get basic rights that were guaranteed in the Constitution, but inalienable under God, but just hadn't been given, right? So very just different in the nature of it. And I tell people, don't assume what you would do if you were in one of the other positions either, right? Don't think too much of yourself to say I wouldn't be grasping power if I had the opportunity to do it. But I think the nature of it was just very different.
So, I think that there are those who would argue whether, on the right, that they're battling for recognizing the rights of the unborn, for example. And those on the left would say, well, we're battling for the recognition of the rights of the LGBT community. Transgender athlete case went to the Supreme Court this week. The reports are that the court is favorable to restricting their participation in sports. We'll see how the court comes down. But I do think that there are elements on on all sides of the culture war, thinking that they're also contending for fundamental rights rather than power. But you see the culture war in terms of power over and power to define what is an American.
Yeah, that's the difference. So you're right. I think that's fair. There are elements, and that's why I said earlier that these conversations are important. They're not they matter. It's about how we go about it. So even with fighting for those rights, I also want to control the universities and what they're able to teach. I also want to control what comes over the airways and who has more say. That right. It's bigger than just the rights. It's the control of the messaging and what America represents. That's the difference, which isn't to say there aren't some rights included in there. I think it just exceeds that.
I think a lot of our listeners will be hearing what you say. They'll be agreeing with your assessment, but I think the central problem is that many of us, well, all of us, are trapped within a certain political dynamic. We're either Democratic or we're Republican. We express our civic duties through that framework that exists. And when we do that, we enter into this sort of polarized, sort of unreasonable, irrational world. I guess what I'm trying to say is these are very highfalutin ideas. They're important ideas. Are they practical?
No, that's good. And that's why this book is so important, because I could sit here and talk to you in theory and say, this is what we could do, and this is what moral imagination could help us with. But I'm giving you historical facts. I'm giving you proof of concept through people who were in a worse situation than I'm imagining either three of us are in today, that actually did what the Bible said and were very effective. And I would say that even if it wasn't effective socially, it was still the right thing. This is one of the most effective movements that we've seen. So you see both of those there. But to get to another part of what you were saying was that's one of the keys here too. And another reason why I wanted to write the book was I wanted to correct the historical record on what the civil rights movement was, because I think the left and the right uses that movement for their own benefit. The civil rights movement was not simply like a progressive movement, and it wasn't just a movement for color blindness, as someone on the right would say. The civil rights movement was very interesting about it, and I get deeper into this in the book. They were watching the beginnings of the culture war. They were seeing the American church, the white American church, split apart into this mainline evangelical fight. And as they were watching it, if you look at their denominational newspapers and publications, they were saying, hey, we're watching this, and I don't think we can choose either side, because I don't think either side gets this right. They were saying, we can't go with the right because we'll lose our bodies, because there's no justice there and they're not fighting to protect us as people, right? We can't go with the left because we'll lose our souls, because they're walking away from the gospel. They very clearly saw what the left was doing as walking away from the authority of scripture and leaving the true foundation of the religion. These were things they were saying. These were things that they were watching, and it was a deliberate decision not to go in that direction. And even if you see, I mean, somebody who probably doesn't get enough recognition in this conversation is someone like Reverend Shuttlesworth, who is someone who was on the front lines in Birmingham of some of these protests. He's trying to integrate schools. His house is getting bombed. Dr. King called him the bravest person in the movement. At the same time, he would look at these juke joints that were in his neighborhood and say, we have to shut these down, because not only is the oppression that's coming from outside our community bad, these things that are killing our men, stealing money out of our homes, are bad too. And so he would bring groups of pastors together to fight against that as well. This was the kind of dynamic that we saw. And I think it's something that Christians should consider, that maybe it's not just about conservative versus progressive. Maybe there's a point here or there on both sides, and a more faithful Christian witness, one that considers the whole counsel of God, would maybe do some of both.
So it's not getting caught in one perspective or another. It's forging a new way of looking at the world and looking at the challenges that we're facing, and it's a biblically faithful perspective.
Exactly.
You know,
Love that.
it strikes me. It strikes me that the kind of culture war polarization has dominated Congress and has led to virtual standstill, complete dysfunction. Um, I'm old enough to remember the days when you had the likes of Ted Kennedy, progressive Democrat, and Orrin Hatch, conservative LDS Republican, um, collaborating on political measure after measure, bill after bill, finding common ground to advance important legislation. We just don't have that kind of thing happening these days, and we haven't for a long time. The understanding that the way to move forward is by reaching hands over to those on the quote other side, those who have significant differences, and finding ways that we can work together. Um, I think that's part of what I think I'm hearing you kind of say.
Yeah, it'd be great to have a return to that, but we know that the tribalism just got turned up, right? And so the narrative became, if you even speak to the people on the other side or try to do anything with them, then you're not one of us. And we see this in immigration. Rubio tries to talk to the Democrats. Cruz comes in and knocks him down for even trying to do that. This is something that's intensified over the years, and it makes no sense. I think even in my community, if you go talk to a Republican, even if he's about to be president, you've somehow betrayed everyone. It's like, why wouldn't I? It doesn't mean I'm going to agree with them. Why wouldn't I talk to somebody who has that much power to at least see where they're coming from? But that's the tribalism of it. And again, it's the good versus evil framework that we have taken so far.
So, Justin, I'm wondering if one of the elephants in the room here is social media and the use of social media by Christians to get their news, to exchange their points of view. Because I think the advent of this really polarized political situation can be dated almost from the rise of many social media platforms. Do you think that's a factor?
Oh yeah, that's certainly a factor. Many of our opinions are bad, and you might even say they stink because we lack media hygiene. We in our desire for confirmation bias, we listen to the same people just tell us what we wanted to hear, and we hear parts of what the other side is saying, but it's usually the worst characters of the other side. We're not hearing the best arguments on the other side. And when you do that, you just have bad opinions. Alan hit it earlier. These algorithms are bad. Even in what happened in Minneapolis, there were influencers who are only showing one or two of the clips. And so people on one side of it didn't even know the other clips existed. So they really didn't have a true view of what happened. They're just following what I've been calling and I didn't make the name, so I don't want to give that impression, but these conflict entrepreneurs whose platform is built on division. And so if all we're getting is these conflict entrepreneurs, they begin to disciple us in how we deal with our neighbors and how we engage socially. And that's a bad way to go. We have to, again, be deliberate about having media hygiene, which to me means having sources on both sides of the conversation or multiple sides of the conversation that we may not agree with, but that we trust to be intellectually honest and we think are diligent and intelligent. If you don't think anybody on the other side is intellectually honest or diligent and intelligent, the problem is partially you. Because there are people I disagree with that I can say he's intelligent and intellectually honest.
It's fascinating when a news story breaks, and I've started this practice. When a news story breaks, flipping between different news sources and getting my information from different news sources and realizing that different news sources are omitting certain bits of information or enhancing other bits of information. And it's become, just crystal clear that we're living in a society where there is no agreed reality. And so how can we have a conversation?
Yeah, it's tough. It only if we see ourselves as just receiving this information and having no impact on creating the incentives and things of that nature, it's going to continue. We have to say, hey, if there's been influencers who've been caught making clips look different than they really were, all this, something has to happen when people do that. We can't just follow people because we like them and then um not hold them accountable when they're not being intellectually honest. We have to hold people accountable, even in our tribe.
Well, I like your phrase media hygiene, whether you originated it or not. It strikes me that that's an entire project that needs to happen where we educate people about how to have media hygiene, how to be able to cut through the algorithms and find responsible voices, so that how do we exercise judgment if we're only seeing a very small piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, it's very true. And no, that's not my term. I've heard it bounce around here and there, and I can't remember exactly where I got it. I wish I could cite it, but I do think it hits at what we're missing and where we need to go.
Well, the other thing I wanted to ask was about the tribalism and how, taking us back to the civil rights era and the movement then, um, how did they see the quote the enemy and what they were fighting for in a non-tribal manner?
Yes. So one example I can give you, maybe an illustration is the best way to show you this, is Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer, she made it her job, along with some others in Mississippi in the 60s under Jim Crow, to go around the country and not go around the country, go around Mississippi and demystify the political process to people there. Because even when they got the right to vote, if you've never done it before, it just doesn't seem real. People have to explain to you that this actually can help you. You do have a voice now. So she was going around to do that. She gets pulled over by a highway patrolman. They take her in, and he has another inmate, I guess you could call it, beat her almost till she can't walk. I mean, just beat her just because of what she was doing. No laws violated, anything like that. Years later, she gets asked, and so she obviously tries to get him prosecuted for what he did. He gets off. She gets a fine. Years later, she's asked how she felt about that officer, and here's how they looked at their opposition. She said, "He's broken, and he needs a doctor. America's broken, and Christians have to be the doctor." So she flips it around. She didn't say he's irredeemable. In the way she explains it, he can be helped. He can be different. But right now, he needs help. That's a very different way to look at your opposition. And it's not just to say your opposition is always sick, but to say, I'm not going to demonize them. That's the message there. I'm not going to say that I hate this person. I'm not going to say any of that. I hope they get better. I hope they see it. And it's just a different posture that I think would benefit us today.
There's I'm not quite sure how to say this. Very famously recently, Charlie Kirk's widow publicly forgave the shooter who assassinated her husband, right? And it strikes me that comes from a very kind of, religion is very personal. It's very, my relationship with Christ. Okay, this is a person who did something wrong. He needs to be forgiven. He needs to find his way with Christ. But by contrast, what I see you describing from um, uh, Fannie Lou Hamer is a much larger social construct of religion. It's not just that the officer needs to be forgiven, that, he's part of a society that's broken, that needs Christian witness and healing, not just as a person, but seeing the larger structural problems And, part of the blindness of the right today is the refusal to recognize structural problems, especially with racism.
No, that's it. To understand that there was personal sin, and so his personal sin involved him having her beaten. There was a structural sin that was bigger than that, that may have even pushed him towards it, right? That dealt with the country as a whole and needed to be addressed. And we can see issues on the left. I don't think are much different. There are structural things that we need to deal with, and that being able to hold those together in tension is something that's very different than what we see in the culture war.
So, Justin, someone who picks up your book, someone who may be feeling politically disillusioned, what do you hope they get from reading what you've written?
I hope they feel empowered, because if some of them were very oppressed people who had, like my grandmother, she didn't finish school. There were a lot of things going on. If God could use them to be a model to the world in the way that he did, then he can use you, even if it seems on a smaller level. If you're willing to reflect Jesus in how you go about, how you approach things. We have this thing here in America now that if my person doesn't get chosen as the president, then all is lost for the next 4 years. I think that's ridiculous. You always have a sphere of influence, and you need to identify that and use it in the best way that you know how. And it may include helping people who might not help you. And that spirit is kind of what drives the civil rights movement. The other thing that I would say is we tend to think that having a good cause and fighting against the right bad people makes what we're doing good, and that's just not true. The spirit of a cause is just as important as the objectives. And just because you think your objective is good, I can point to so many historical figures that had a good objective and ended up being monsters. We have to have the right spirit.
Justin, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast, to share with our listeners about your new book. And we wish you all the best in your coming endeavors.
Thanks, Bettina and Alan. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
And it bears repeating before we close the title of the book: Don't Let Nobody Turn You Around, How the Black Church's Public Witness Leads Us Out of the Culture War. And I hope that you join us in wanting a way out of the culture war. Well, Bettina, this is a subject that I was really eager to get to because, I've always had a heart for the civil rights movement. It was very much a part of my life growing up, although I was a little too young to be a participant. But the idea that there was something about the Black church's public witness that we need to learn from today, I think is really important.
And his emphasis on refusing to be trapped into certain partisan frameworks. I mean, I think that is absolutely crucial, not just for Christians, but for all Americans who are trying to make their way in today's really crazy political environment.
Well, here we are. Our nation is celebrating our 250th anniversary. And so, we're kind of re-emphasizing our tribal identity as Americans, right? And yet, tribalism is at the root of the problems in the culture war, and it's something that we really need to recognize and deal with.
Justin has actually written another book, Alan. I'm not sure if you've come across it. It's called Compassion and Conviction. And it addresses exactly this issue, which is tribalism, political tribalism, and faithful Christian engagement with that. And so if you have his current book on your reading list, I'd encourage you also to put Compassion and Conviction on your reading list as well. Though I'm guessing that reading list is getting pretty long, right?
Oh, yes, it is getting long, and you know, I'll confess that after a hard day of in the trenches dealing with lawsuits and civil rights, um, sometimes Netflix is preferable to a good read. Some mindless engagement with fantasy that Hollywood dishes out. But we all need a little escape once in a while from uh, the serious stuff that we're facing every day in this world, right?
Right. And, Justin's comment on social media hygiene, I think news consumption hygiene is also something we should keep in mind. I give myself a 6 or 7 p.m. deadline for checking the headlines. And after that, I'm with you, Alan. I'm out.
Well, I think, one of my takeaways is there really is a work to be done on media hygiene,
Yeah.
right? On, for one thing, identifying um, responsible voices on from various perspectives and encouraging rank and file church members, people, here are responsible voices. You're going to agree with some, disagree with others, but if you want to be have a good grasp of what's really going on, then you need to resist. I like that term he used, conflict entrepreneurs.
Yes. It captures exactly what it is, that someone is making bucks from exploiting conflict.
Well, a lot of people are. And
Yeah.
driving conflict, because of course conflict sells, right?
Yes. Yes.
You know, um, I mean, frankly, that's how Trump got so much success in his political career, because he would say and do outrageous things and get lots of news coverage, and you know, um, it's very very effective, whether you like him or hate him. It's got to recognize how effective it's been.
Mm. Which leads me to think we need to do another program, Alan, on media. Maybe that should be on our list to do.
Be nice to find somebody who could really speak to media hygiene. I'm thinking I'd like to make that a project for our website.
Thank you for joining us, listeners. Until next time, please remember, stay informed, get engaged, and remember that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.